I'm going to focus mainly on the early modern period and the Enlightenment, and I think reflecting ways that are helpfully going to dovetail with some of what the first paper was engaging with. I'm going to be looking at the state of nature idea across Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, which may be a bit of a fool's errand. So I'm necessarily going to deal with these thinkers somewhat superficially. And my opening reflection is to wonder whether there is, in fact, a simple concept of the state of nature, whether there is a state of nature. Because of course, the Hobbesian state of nature is very different to the Lockean, and the Lockean and the Hobbesian are very different to the Rousseauian states of nature. Not to mention other thinkers who have used this language, not to mention that Hobbes has at least 3 different versions of the state of nature, and Rousseau has at least 2, and they are very different from each other. And so what do we mean when we talk about the state of nature? Can we talk about the state of nature at all? I think we can. And I want to try and explain in what way we can in this paper. Because underneath all the very, very substantial differences between Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and other thinkers, and within these thinkers themselves, when it comes to theorizing and understanding the state of nature, I think there are important continuities. And I think, furthermore, these important continuities can help us to understand the modernity of which they are part in a new way. Not in the only way possible, but with some fresh insights, I think. At least that's the wager of this paper. That's what I'm going to try and argue. I'm taking my cue from a way of doing intellectual history that has been shaped largely by Michel Foucault, and I think Bruno Latour does this as well. So the part of Foucault and Latour that I'm picking on is when they select a particularly vivid example of something and then use that as a lens through which to bring into focus features that are particular to a certain historical or cultural moment. And the example is a very intense way of articulating something that is more diffusely characteristic of a broader historical period. This is, I think, what Foucault does with the Panopticon in Discipline and Punish, where he draws disciplinary power out in conversation with this particularly intense example of the Panopticon. And I think it's what Latour does with Hobbes's Leviathan and Boyle's air pump in We've Never Been Modern as well. And so with the aid of the Panopticon, Foucault distills the threefold schema of hierarchical observation, normalizing judgment, and examination. And in conversation with Leviathan and the air pump, Latour elaborates what he calls the modern constitution with its 2 dynamics of purification and translation. And so what I'm going to try and do is take the state of nature idea and do with it what I take Foucault to be doing with the Panopticon and what I take Latour to be doing with Leviathan and the air pump. And in the foreword to the English edition of The Order of Things, Foucault calls these pervasive features like normalizing judgments and so forth figures. So I'm going to be using that same language. I'm going to try and talk about the figures of the state of nature. What are the broad social characteristics that are present in a particularly intense form in the state of nature idea? And it's these figures that I think are broadly consistent across Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, underneath the very, very different context that they give to the state of nature idea. I'm going to propose that there are 3 figures of the state of nature, and I'm going to call them a flattening, a partition, and a normalization. A flattening, a partition, and a normalization. And I'm going to try and argue that they yield an understanding of the early modern period in the Enlightenment that overlaps with, but is also distinct from Foucault and Latour's figures, the way in which they try and understand these periods. In other words, the state of nature brings something new to the table when it comes to understanding this thing called modernity, of which we find ourselves part. So first of all, then, a flattening. The state of nature is characterized, I suggest, by a figure of flattening. Described in its most abstract terms, flattening describes the creation and curation of a qualitatively undifferentiated and homogeneous field within which distinctions can subsequently be made. It's a decoupling and a disembedding of modern imaginaries from any fixed transcendent references or traditional boundaries in a way that makes the world and society level and smooth and unbroken and uniform. First of all, the state of nature flattens in this way social difference. All non-European peoples are understood as existing in the same homogeneous, undifferentiated condition, precisely the state of nature, with no significant cultural diversity. Even Rousseau, who has multiple stages to the state of nature in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, seems to assume that these stages are universal, that all societies pass through them. And in no place that I've been able to come across in Hobbes, Locke, or Rousseau is the definite article of the state of nature ever contested or problematized or pluralized. And this flattening of social difference is accompanied by a flattening of traditions. The state of nature and the social contract conspire to make distinctive cultural traditions and histories at best peripheral and at worst invisible to social calculus. The particular practices and the particular histories of peoples in the state of nature are largely immaterial. And in the case of Hobbes and Locke, this original condition is framed as a timeless state without progress, without history indeed. The state of nature also whitewashes the past of modern civil societies, replacing their histories of violence and conquest with a likely story of free universal consent. Secondly, in terms of flattening, the second way in which the state of nature stories flatten is that they flatten social structure. There are no stable social hierarchical distinctions within the state of nature. Hobbes famously describes its inhabitants as an amorphous and unstable multitude. And both Locke and Rousseau, while on occasion admitting rudimentary family structures in the state of nature, allow for no pan-social enduring hierarchies. Thirdly, I think there's also an ethical flattening. All the ethical principles of the state of nature are derived from a very small number of immanent conditions, don't require any transcendent source. So Hobbes derives his ethics from the appetites. Whatever is an object of a person's desire, that person calls good, and whatever is an object of their aversion, they call evil. Locke makes the law of nature synonymous with reason in the second treatise, which he takes to be universal. And Rousseau draws the ethics of the state of nature out of two sentiments, pity and a desire for self-preservation that he calls amour de soi-même. So that's the flattening, the way in which all these three different states of nature stories, in their different ways, perform this similar move of flattening. So after flattening, the second characteristic of the state of nature is partition. This homogeneous flattened plane that's been created by the flattening is divided by a single partition, leaving two dichotomized poles. This partition is immanent to the plane, it's not imposed from above, and it emerges within it, we might say, like a fold. And this partition arises most iconically between the state of nature itself and, for Hobbes, the commonwealth, or perhaps the civil society, whatever it is that defines itself in contradistinction to the state of nature under the social contract. And because of the systematic flattening on which it supervenes, this partition becomes the determinate social distinction, the major social distinction. But the more we consider this partition, the more problematic it reveals itself to be. Chronologically, this is less clear in Hobbes, but more clear in Locke and Rousseau. Chronologically, the state of nature is supposed to precede civil society. But in fact, it is irreducibly parasitic upon the civil society that retrojects it. It's always necessarily retrojected from within civil society. There can be no state of nature as such if there is no civil society to contrast it with. French philosopher Michel Serres has this lovely line at one point in his writing: if there were only one season, there would be no seasons. There has to be some sort of distinction in order for the state of nature to appear as such. That's the point here. Furthermore, it is systematically characterized as a negation of everything that civil society prides itself upon, and therefore it's parasitic upon civil society in this second sense as well. I'll quote Hobbes, because he's the clearest on this, but I think this definition by negation is there in Locke and Rousseau as well. So it's a very famous quotation from Leviathan, chapter 13, where Hobbes is defining the state of nature as a systematic negation of the commonwealth. In such condition, he says, there's no place for industry. So here we go with the negations, no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and, which is the worst of all, continual fear, danger, and violent death, and very famously the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, in short. 11 negations as a way to define the state of nature. The state of nature is a lack. It is a systematic lack of everything that is present in civil society, and therefore it has to be a retrojection from within civil society. It can only be conceived as the negative image of what civil society understands itself to be the positive image of. And therefore, the state of nature and civil society have to be mutually parasitic and symbiotic. And the partition is necessarily an unstable and a problematic one between these two entities. So that's the partition. Thirdly, normalization. The third figure of the state of nature, after the creation of a flat homogeneous plane and the introduction of a single determinate partition within that plane, is the figure of normalization. And what I mean by this is that one of the sides of that partition is used as a norm against which to measure and evaluate the other one. For Hobbes and Locke, the state of nature is measured against civil society, and lo and behold, shock horror, it's found wanting. This is the so-called Lockean proviso, the idea that the life of the poorest labourer in civil society will be better than that of a monarch in the state of nature, and no one should be worse off in civil society than they will be outside of it. In Rousseau's case, this normativity is a lot more complex. A lot of things are more complex in Rousseau. His stadial state of nature in the second discourse has a particular moment in it that he characterizes as the youth of the world, about which he argues, quote, all subsequent progress has been so many steps in appearance towards the perfection of the individual and in effect toward the decrepitude of the species. So it appears that this youth of the world moment is some sort of peak humanity, that if we managed to remain in that state, there would have been a certain beatitude to that. The pity and the amour de soi that characterize the moral psychology of the state of nature are to be cultivated and preserved in society for Rousseau. We don't leave them behind. as some relic of a previous moment. And his vision of society in the 1762 text of the social contract, it can be viewed as a way of preserving or cultivating or substituting for these virtues of the state of nature within civil society. So the norm for Rousseau is more complex, but I think there's still a sense in which the state of nature is providing a more complex sort of norm against which civil society can be measured. So the modalities, therefore, are very different, but it nevertheless remains that all three of these social contract theories use the state of nature to provide some sort of norm, some sort of degree zero measure of humanity, for better or worse, against which modern societies are then measured. It's what Georges Canguilhem calls a normative norm, a standard that permits judgments of justice and value rather than simply a statistical norm, a descriptive norm. Moving on now to consider the modern in the light of this description of the figures of the state of nature. The flattening, partition, and normalization then provide a schema, I suggest, for understanding features that pervade the early modern period and the Enlightenment more broadly, and that still, I think, substantially characterize our own historical moment. Here are three quick examples, and there'll be far too little detail in these, so I apologize for the sketchiness, but I just want to give a sense of how this might work itself out in understanding broader trends. So first of all, time, modern understandings of time. There's a flattening in modernity of the qualitatively different times that rhythm the pre-modern calendar, what Charles Taylor in A Secular Age calls higher time, times of transcendence, holy days. Modernity then cleaves this flattened temporality in two, creating a partition between, for example, an enlightened present and future and a superstitious past. Enlightenment is then normalized and used as a measure against which the benighted past is found wanting. Thank goodness that we live when we do and not in previous centuries. Or take space. The Galilean and Cartesian mathematization of space can be viewed profitably, I think, as a flattening, a smoothing away, for example, of the sub- and superlunary distinctions of the medieval world or the Aristotelian world, and the qualitatively different spaces of Aristotelian physics. Social space is similarly flattened in the modern period, with a stripping away of the complex medieval centers of sovereignty and social hierarchies to leave essentially two poles, the central sovereign, the Leviathan, if you like, and the individual and individualized citizen that is directly exposed to the sovereignty of the Leviathan. And within this flattened plane, a partition is made between spaces of civilization and spaces of quote-unquote savagery. Or in Locke's case, between land lying in waste and land made productive, which is a similarly geographic split. He sees the land of the Americas as being wasted, lying in waste. And the modern world understands then both its geography and its colonial politics in terms of this binary division of space, with spaces of civilization providing a norm against which other spaces are found wanting. Third quick example, epistemologies. Whether we take idealist or empirical or sentimental modern epistemologies, I think these same three figures obtain. They all begin with a flattening of the epistemological field. Hobbes's rejection of authorities, for example, is wanting to rely on what he calls his geometrical method. Locke's famous tabula rasa in the essay concerning human understanding, or the hyperbolic doubt of Descartes' discourse on method, a sort of flattening the terrain of what might be known. And it's been argued, interestingly, that Rousseau has a similar Cartesian moment, although he doesn't avert to the rational cogito, but to a sentiment intérieur, a certain conscience, a sense of conscience through which he roots knowledge and produces what he calls moral truths. So in all these cases, there's a flattening of the epistemological field. Within this flattened plane, a partition is drawn between falsehood, authority, superstition, Aristotle often, on one side, and on the other side, a single privileged mode of truth production. For Hobbes, it's the geometrical method. Whether he follows it is a different question, and Hobbes scholars differ greatly on whether it's anything more than rhetorical, but to the extent that it is rhetorical, it is significant for the way he conceives how he is producing knowledge. For Locke, it's sensibility informed by reason. For Descartes, it's the cogito and the necessary inferences that can be drawn from it. And for Rousseau, it's the insistence on the primacy of conscience and the sentiment intérieur, what we might think of as a sentio ergo sum. The final section now of this paper. Where does all this leave the state of nature idea? How are we to understand the relationship between the state of nature motif and the broader trends in the period that it focalizes, that I've been trying to sketch in the second part of the paper? Well, like Foucault and Latour, I'm not interested in establishing causality. I'm not trying to argue that the state of nature is, in a sense, the spearhead motif that's provoking or causing any of these broader trends. It may or may not be, but that's not my argument. I do want to argue, however, that the state of nature isn't merely an example of these broader features of modernity. I want to argue that it's more like a laboratory. Now, this section is very speculative. I'm very happy for you to take issue with what I'm about to say, but let me have a go. We'll see how it comes out. A laboratory is, first of all, an artificial space, in the sense that it's purified and stripped of complexities that are present in daily life. In Georges Conghien's terms, the laboratory is, quote, a place where artificers intended to make the real manifest are worked out. A place where artificers that are intended to make the real manifest are worked out. So in other words, the artificiality is productive of knowledge about the real itself. That's what the laboratory is. So the state of nature, therefore, acts as such a space within modernity. It makes manifest, or so it is thought, aspects of human nature that remain obscure in everyday life, and it does so precisely because of its artificiality. Just as a footnote, this is why a lot of the debates about whether the state of nature is intended to be a real empirical historical reality or a thought experiment, I think, are missing the point about the purpose of artificiality in the production of truth that happens in the locus of the state of nature. But that's not what I'm arguing here. So in other words, the state of nature produces knowledge about the human precisely through its artificiality, just as a laboratory produces knowledge about the world precisely as a function of its artificial constraints. Different versions of the state of nature still produce knowledge today. Steven Pinker's Hobbesianism, Rutger Bregman's Rousseauianism. In fact, contemporary Hobbesians spar with contemporary Rousseauians over cultural and political questions today in a way that continues to produce truth and knowledge about contemporary society. The state of nature also produces lived experience. In other words, if we think this to be a reality, it conditions the way we engage with the world. And over time, therefore, it can shape material conditions. If people are engaging with the world in a state of naturishly inflected way, that will shape material conditions over time. The state of nature is a motif, therefore, of what Foucault, in relation to the panopticon, calls, quote, imaginary intensity. He says, this imaginary intensity gives rise, even in our own time, to many variations projected and realized. He's talking about the panopticon and the way that it's been incredibly fruitful culturally. And this last word in the Foucault quote, realized, is really crucial, I think, because it shows that the imaginary of the state of nature doesn't merely reflect or represent modern assumptions and sensibilities. It informs modern colonial, ecological, and secularizing imaginaries, and therefore shapes material conditions in modernity in an active way rather than simply describing them. A laboratory, thirdly, is also a generalizable space. So it is artificial, but the truth produced in it wouldn't count for anything if it couldn't then be generalized to the whole of society. Although it's separated from the rest of the world and subject to artificial constraints, the knowledge it produces needs to be valid outside the space of the laboratory, just as it is within it. And this is the pattern of Foucault's discussion of the panopticon prison. Although it's a particularly clear and intense instance of disciplinary power, it provides what he calls, quote, a generalizable model of functioning. And it lends its name to a general condition of society. He calls it panopticism, or the panoptic schema. Similarly, the flattening, partition, and normalization that are vividly present in the state of nature motif and in the social contract narratives of Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau are indicative of what perhaps we could call a generalized society of the state of nature, or society status naturae, a society in the image of the state of nature, indicative of modern imaginaries, to the extent that this flattening and partition and normalization are characteristic of broad trends within modern societies. And this, I would argue, is precisely the society that we are living in today. And I think we see it very clearly in modern colonial, post-colonial, secularizing and ecological imaginaries. And if we had more time, we could go into how the state of nature continues to shape the way that these debates are happening in society today. So, to finish, how does this state of nature then yield a distinctive account of the early modern period, different from those of Foucault and Latour? What am I trying to add to what they've already said? Let's take Foucault first. The flattening, partition, and normalization of the state of nature, I think, distinguish themselves from Foucault's insistence, certainly in the order of things, on the status of epistemes as what he calls the unconscious of knowledge. Because flattening, partition, and normalization are not in themselves unconscious. They're very deliberate in what Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau are doing. They're not merely the unconscious conditions of possibility of knowledge, although, as we have seen, they do produce knowledge in modernity. The figures of the state of nature are created and curated, if you like, in plain sight. Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau would have said, yes, this is what I am doing. This is my intention. The relationship then between the state of nature and the modern is different to the relationship between the conscious and the unconscious. And my approach, I think, allows us to understand the materiality and the conscious construction of the state of nature, not merely as expressing epistemes that pre-exist them, but as actively creating, actively forming, and we might say actively performing the imaginary within which they function as a node of intensification. In other words, the approach that I'm arguing for here allows for more of a dialectic, I think, between materiality and ideality, between conditions of possibility and conditioned possibilities, than is possible with the conscious-unconscious distinction. Secondly, Latour. In relation to the purification and translation of Latour's modern constitution, and We've Never Been Modern, the biggest difference, I think, is in the figure of flattening. I'm not sure that Latour fully accounts, or at least explicitly accounts, for this moment of flattening. Flattening indicates the importance of a moment logically prior to the separation of the human and the non-human, or of nature and culture. A moment that makes possible what Latour describes as the modern constitution. I think his account of modernity neglects or perhaps assumes this moment of flattening. Now, none of this is to say that Latour and Foucault are incorrect in their theorizing of modernity. It's simply that neither of their ways of figures for understanding modernity exhaust the figures that can be drawn out of the richness of the complex modern world. And so to finish, I want to evoke figure in a different sense, in terms of the figure ground structure of perception. Within a given perceptual field, we all necessarily distinguish a local figure from a background. For me now, it's your faces that I'm focusing on, and there's lots of peripheral information that I'm not paying attention to, although I could if I chose to. We can't focus on everything. We have to make choices. We have to neglect some of the information that's coming to us perceptually in order to make sense of anything at all. And similarly, I think each set of figures allows us to make sense of aspects of the modern, to become sensitive to different potentials and dangers inherent in the modern. And the flattening, partition, and normalization that I'm suggesting don't invalidate the figures that Foucault and Latour are suggesting. I think they sit alongside them and create different sensitivities, different figures on the ground of the modern. So in this way, flattening, partition, and normalization sit alongside other sets of figures as a way of making sense of a period in the shadow of which we still live today. Thank you. There we go. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting paper. So I guess my question is closer to a clarifying question. So in my understanding, one of the arguments is that the implication or the understanding of stage of nature still persists in a modern society as imagination. And I guess I was not sure whether, I'll give you the example. So I think you claim that some aspect of state of nature, such as flattening, still persists in the modern society, and the partition between state of nature and civil society still exists as a partition within the civil society. So I do see your argument that these figures or division of flattening still work in our modern imagination, but at the same time, I don't see like a good comparison that exactly match. For example, in the social construct theory, the partitions between, as you mentioned, the civil society and the state of nature. But in the modern society, I think you're arguing that it is a partition within the civil society, and the flattening was in the state of nature. But I think you're all arguing that flattening also exists in the state of nature. So I didn't see like a very good match between the two comparison.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That's really helpful. That does allow me to clarify. I think we see the flattening today in the assumption that it is very easy to not to have to question that the social structure is fundamentally flat. So the attachment that we have to the idea of equality in modernity is one example of this flattening. And I think to the extent, and if I understand the second part of the question properly, and I'm not sure that I do, so come back to me if I'm not quite scratching where you're itching with this one, is that the distinction between civil society and the state of nature is still casts its shadow over our society today. And we wouldn't use that language, of course, anymore. And we probably would be horrified to be sort of, branded with that very crude distinction. But I think it is latent. I think it's latent in foreign policy. I think it's latent in attitudes to the natural world. I think there's still an idea, and this is very prominent in Locke, of uncultivated land as being synonymous with waste land. And there's one critic, I can't remember who it was, said every tree is lumber in waiting for the modern sensibility. I think there's still a sense of, you can see how that body's formed. And I think that in a way that would be slightly harder to summarize in one sentence, I think modern ideas of the secular buy into these similar ideas. So I think, although the language has shifted and people wouldn't identify with these terms, I think this structure, these figures of a flat world with a fundamental partition, one side of which is normalized, still does characterize a great deal of the way in which we engage with reality.
Yeah, so I mean, that expression totally fine with me if you're making you explain the division between, say, developed world and developing world. But I think part of your argument also includes the partition between the sovereign and the people. So even within the civil society, I think you're trying to apply this partition. So that's where I had a problem.
Yeah, well, I wasn't majoring on that in the paper. I think that the fundamental partition that I'm keen to explore ideologically is the state of nature civil society partition. I think that the point that Peter was indicating earlier, that the position of the sovereign in relation to the contract is a complex one. Certainly in Hobbes, that the sovereign isn't part of the contract, and necessarily so, because it allows them to be sovereign. So I think there'd definitely be more work that would need to be done on positioning sovereignty in relation to the partition that I didn't do in this paper. You're quite right. I didn't cover that. But Flora, then Alicia, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I don't want to be an ungrateful host, but I completely disagree with you. So, and I'll try to be short, but I, especially from your response, it seems to me that your paper repeats, I think, a flow of reasoning, which is in order to criticize the contemporary state of affairs, you aim at the early modern, in order not to put the responsibility on some 20th century thinkers like Foucault, I think, who has a lot of responsibility in the mess we're living. So I think maybe there's maybe you're aiming at the wrong target here. And just again on Foucault, I think I think there's a problem in his approach, which you say you are following, for instance, with the panopticon and saying, oh, this is the example that represents a whole culture. Well, I would say Foucault is a philosopher and he's also a man. And I think that there's a certain predatory behavior in his way of making generalizations, in choosing one example in a rather arbitrary way, because he's leaving every other testimonies of the era that he is studying, like literature, for instance. Foucault doesn't understand literature. So I think there's an issue in that particular approach, in just picking one example, arbitrarily deciding this is representative of a whole era, and then drawing generalizations from that. And so this is why I don't agree, especially with Rousseau, with the three figures that you identified. And again, I'm going to focus on Rousseau because that's the author I know most, but I don't think there's a flattening in his state of nature. Hypothesis. I think actually his state of nature is deepening our understanding of especially, I would say he's deepening our understanding of what we as humans are doing on Earth. So he's deepening our understanding of our ecological responsibilities. He's also deepening our understanding of other cultures. I think Rousseau is, I think, one of the first to say that the so-called savages are actually the product of a history, that they do have a history. I don't think that either that there's a partition between the state of nature and cultural civil society in Rousseau, because I think that was what he's actually interested in a way that's maybe close to an author, one of his contemporaries, Marivaux. And I think in both Marivaux and Rousseau, the focus is not on the partition between the state of nature and culture. The focus is on how the state of nature and culture interact, and how they both, interact in predictable ways. And therefore, I'm not sure I agree with the normalization point, because Rousseau explicitly says that the state of nature should not be the norm for political. He's basically against social Darwinism. So, I'm sorry, I don't want to sound too negative, but I guess maybe because I did not understand your perceptions, I don't agree with your conclusions.
No, not at all. And thank you. I think there's, I think that is offered in just the sort of spirit that I was hoping that comments would be offered in here. Let me try and respond to the things that you've raised. I'm not sure that I'm seeking to put responsibility on the early modern period to the exclusion of other moments. I think my argument is more descriptive, that figures that are characteristic of this period still cast a shadow over the way in which we think about society today. Now, of course, other figures do as well, and arguments could be made about the way in which concepts from the Christian tradition also fundamentally shape the way that we think today. And of course, there will be other moments to add, sort of subsequent to the early modern period. And so this is, if you like, one layer of a progressive palimpsest that has brought us to the point we are, but nevertheless, I'm focusing on this particular layer and saying that there are significant shapes of thinking and being in the world that are intensely articulated in the state of nature idea that do happen to still shape us today, and that is a descriptive statement. So I'm not saying that is, you know, the fault necessarily of that moment, but it happens to be the case that we are shaped in that way. I'm not sure that I'd share your reading of Foucault as arbitrarily choosing motifs like the panopticon. My reading of what he does is that there's a dialectic between the particular instance that he chooses, like the panopticon, and the broader social trends of disciplinary power. And so, you know, in Discipline and Punish, he doesn't begin by speaking about the panopticon. He draws on it at a certain point in the argument to say, look how clearly these things are shown in this particular cultural artifact. And then he goes on after that to continue talking about disciplinary power. So I agree that the example itself is doing work for him, but I don't think it's doing all the work. And I don't think it's an arbitrary choice. I think certainly the way he's looking at it, it comes out of the modalities of disciplinary power that he has discerned elsewhere, and that he then goes on to talk about after he's discussed the panopticon. I agree with you that Rousseau is deepening our knowledge, but I'm not sure that that means that he cannot be producing a flattening in the way that I've described. I'm not sure that I disagree with your description of Rousseau, but let me try and explain how within that I still think that there's a flattening taking place. It is endlessly fascinating, isn't it? The extent, why Rousseau constructs the second discourse in the way that he does, and puts so much of the detail in the notes, and not in the main text. And despite the fact that he is bringing in this fine-grained detail in the notes, he still persists with the definite article of the state of nature and doesn't use the material that he's got to problematize this sort of monolithic notion. I do think he's flattening in the sense that certainly his description of the pure state of nature and the early moments of the state of nature in the second discourse is one of solitary existence. So he is breaking down a sense of irreducible and original social structure, that there is a flat social hierarchy out of which groups then form in the state of nature. And I think I agree that there's a lot in Rousseau on the way in which the state of nature and civil society interact, and the way in which you know, his discourse around Spartan societies is a strange way to try and recreate somewhat artificially the idea of sort of pity that's there in the state of nature. But I think you can't have that interaction unless you've got a partition. So you've got to have two things to interact. And unless there is this fundamental partition that's qualitatively different, I think, to the stages of the state of nature that he has, you can't have a meaningful interaction, because it would be something interacting with itself. And I completely agree that the norm in Rousseau is more complex. It's not the sort of Hobbesian idea of how terrible it was, we were all at war with each other, and now how wonderful it is that we've got this despotic leader over us. It's much more complex than that. So I agree. I agree with that. And Alicia.
So I wanted to ask what happens to the category or the concept of ideology if we sort of go your dialectical route, because I was sort of thinking, like if I was to position you between, let's say, McPherson's possessive individualism, where, you know, possessive individualism is the sort of background ideology through which we sort of read all of these, you know, state of nature or social contract, you know, expressions. And if we go to sort of the unconscious, ideology sort of doesn't work anymore, we need to talk about in terms of imaginaries, but then critiquing imaginaries becomes more difficult because they're just imaginaries. So yeah, I guess I'm wondering where you does like ideology work for you, or imaginaries, or something else?
I think that the state of nature is an attempt within, you know, again, what Charles Taylor might call a modern immanent frame, to retain the idea of the possibility of ideology critique. So, you know, traditionally, there would be a sense that there is a measure of the good that is outside society, against which we can measure society, and God gives it to us. And therefore, there's no circular argument there. It's not society judging itself. Now, you get into the modern sort of secularizing moment, and you don't have that reference anymore. So how can you do meaningful social critique? How can you critique the way things are? Because the way things are is what there is. It's everything that there is. There's nothing outside the way things are. You know, there's gradual change over time, but there's no qualitative ruptures in order to be able to say, this is the measure against which we're going to measure the status quo. So how do you get it? Well, the state of nature is one way of manufacturing a condition of human existence qualitatively different to the one that we have at the moment, against which to measure contemporary society, that then serves as the condition of possibility of social critique per se. So without something like the state of nature, it's hard to see how you can make the concept of ideology do the work you need it to do. So I don't think this is directly answering the question in the way that it was put, but I think the state of nature is a necessary postulate, not the only possible necessary postulate, but it is necessary to have something like that in order to be able to do social critique in a way that is able to appeal to something beyond, whether it be, you know, my sense of this thing is not right, or my feeling that it is not right. There is some measure outside of us to say this is not right. Look, this is how things are in the state of nature.
Okay, so I agree, like within bourgeois political thought, that is true. Like that it is exactly that. It's sort of what, I don't know, the position of reality or something like that. But if we, you know, sort of think from a Marxist perspective, then you don't need the state of nature. The state of nature is ideology, and instead what you need is an account of, you know, material conditions and the mode of production, and that's reality. And so you don't need some, you know, imaginary of nature to.
And then I think you're absolutely right. And then the interesting question is, how do you arbitrate between those two senses of what ideology is, other than from within one of those two senses of what ideology, like what do you do with that difference? I think is a really interesting question that arises at that point. I'm aware of time. I think Peter, you have one. We'll do.
Yeah, I'll try to make this
your question quickly, and then we'll wait for.
The Nazis are no. I really like this paper a lot. I think the first paper is fantastic. I was thinking through some of the same issues. That how do we? What is because I was trying to think through what is the relevance of the social contract today? Because a lot of, the state of nature. Because a lot of people would say, after all, we don't longer need it because it's not reason, blah, blah, blah. And so I was trying to think of what is it as a figure. And I thought of that word too, although you went way beyond what I could do, right? Which is that, what is it attempting to do? And I thought of like, what are the figures of state of nature that we have? I have an example I'm going to use tomorrow, right? But like the laboratory, childhood is a good one. These figures of the state of nature that we keep around us in order to have that production of what is civilized, the production of a certain ratio of races, the production of gender, the production, all forms of childhood could be a stand-in, right? Where adult child is the political concept par excellence, right? Which means, going backwards, the state of nature civilized is also rendition. Or just even thinking the modern as the new. It's a partition that bifurcates and then homogenizes the previous. So it is homogenizing in that this is all the same. There's no history, no temporality. That's what I was thinking of your question, right? Does that make sense? And then you have the norm. So I really like this quite a bit, because if we put the state of nature as like a literal history or something, then we're kind of missing what it's still doing for us today, which is as a figure, it's all around, it's all pervasive. And as Marxists would say, when we don't see it, it's probably when it's having most of its effect, right? Like we're saying, oh, we're past that, which means, yeah, I don't know. What do you think? I don't know. Sure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that there'd be a fascinating paper to be written on childhood, and the childhood not only in terms of children, but in terms of the childhood as a motif, the infantilizing of non-European nations in the past, for example, the way, and so this all comes into the temporality of the state of nature as well. The idea that there's what's been called this monorail timeline, that all civilizations are at some point on the same timeline, and those that are not as far progressed as the European nations, and we always, we put ourselves at the top, don't we? Always, are by virtue of that fact infantilized as well, and spoken of as children. I think you still get that language, versions of that language in terms of the developing and the developed world, things like that. It's a version of that same temporality.
Maturity. But I was saying, but that's just one figure, right? Like what you reminded me is once you see that relation, right? Once you get that, it's sort of like you did like a chemical and you get rid of all the accidental features. What is the state of nature as a concept, set of concepts? Then you could see that all around. Childhood is certainly one of them. Then you can sort of see that as we bifurcate our societies, homogenize one of them, right? Yeah, just laboratory is an excellent example. Prisons could be another, right? There's a whole set of, that it could do a lot of social work, I think, in saying the state of nature is not an irrelevant relic of liberalism or something, but in fact actually is something still speaking to us. Maybe not wholly responsible for everything, but yeah, I really like that quite a bit. I think that's really sure.
Thank you so much. We will break.